So the parallel construction there is telling our cells what kinds of molecules to make and guiding our development from a single cell zygote. So um, that's where the parallel is.
Oh,
In
okay.
the and is joining those two um, dependent clauses together. So the whole sentence, second, it directs to a considerable extent the construction of our bodies, comma, telling our cells what kinds of molecules to make and guiding our development from a single-celled zygote to a fully formed adult.
Okay.
Um, that's an interesting one because sometimes they won't use a comma before which, but I think there is a slight pause implied there. So first, it acts as the hereditary material, which is passed down from generation to generation. So hereditary is the word. Hereditary.
Hereditary. Okay, yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, some people say it hereditary. Some people say hereditary.
Mm.
Um, because it's not that much of an everyday word. I think it has a few different pronunciations. Uh, I think that for this kind of word, the schwa is just more common for Australian pronunciation. Um,
These ones. Okay.
yeah, but I don't know what they mean by would it be hereditary?
Yeah,
Hereditary.
this is impossible to pronounce. It's very hard. This one.
I think it might be hereditary. Hereditary.
Hereditary. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Whereas the US is hereditary, which
Yeah.
is more like how I would
Hereditary. Yeah.
say it.
Great. I got it now.
And I think Australian English also often turns things into a schwa sound.
Mm. Yeah. Now it makes sense. Great.
Mm. Um, so yeah, the pause after first. First, it acts as the hereditary material which is passed down from generation to generation. So a pause before which,
Mm.
because which is a it's initiating a what do we call it? It it's kind of commenting. It's a subclause. It's commenting on the main part of the sentence. So I think the problem here is to establish a development. To establish something is to set out its foundations, whereas to develop is obviously for it to change or grow. So we don't really. I know it is probably used quite loosely in other places, but we don't really talk about establishing a development unless we were talking about establishing like a real estate development, which might be then a project that begins by laying out the new property lines and so that's the only sense that I think that this verb establish would go with development. Otherwise, they are kind of contrasting ideas. To establish something is kind of to start it, whereas to develop something is to pick it up during its process of unfolding. Whereas you can guide development because we're imagining that we're already in process and we're changing the direction. I might talk about, you know, one of the jobs of a teacher is to guide the intellectual development of their students. Um, so if we imagine that the students are developing, that is, they're changing and growing, probably to a more mature state, then that's a process that could be guided by different forces or different people. And similarly here, if we imagine that we are developing as organisms, growing and changing as we grow, um, this is talking about DNA as a kind of agent that guides that process. You could use therefore there, I think, um, or at least I often hear uh, it So thus is used in a few different ways. It's sometimes used to talk about the way something is done, and it's sometimes used to talk about the extent or the degree, and it's sometimes used to talk about consequences. And I think here it's talking about consequences. So if bodies are more likely to survive, therefore they're more likely to reproduce. So you could use therefore here as well, because that's also consequences. I think in loose terms, you could use a word like so, and so to reproduce, and your reader or your listener would know that you were talking about consequences as well, but I think it wouldn't typically be used there. Actually planned. They planned to reduce staff and thus to cut costs. So they're saying that they plan to do A, they plan to do B, but they're putting in a relationship of consequences between them. One is a consequence, a further consequence. So this is where the word thus often gets brought in, is if you've got to talk about, you're kind of listing things, but one of them is dependent on another as its consequence. So to understand about the plan to cut costs, you kind of already need to know the first part. So even though they're presented as this and this, one is actually a consequence of the other. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm.